Hi, this is Emily Freitag, and I'm so pleased today to be joined by Bror Saxberg, the head of learning sciences for CZI. And we are going to be talking today about many things, including a deep dive around motivation. So Bror, as we start all of these, I'd love to just hear a story from your journey as a learner and what that has informed about your perspective on learning.
Sure. So it's a bit of a funny story because I lived through it and experienced it, but it's only after many decades that I was able to look back on it and understand what actually happened. So very early on, I got into trouble. When I was in first grade, I was nearly held back from advancing to second grade because of my handwriting. I literally could not make interpretable characters on one line. And so I was the last kid in the whole grade who was still working on 2 lines. And the school policy was you should be held back if you cannot make interpretable characters on a single line for a first grader. And my teacher just absolutely went to bat, and she just, Miss Hutton, and she just totally screamed at people and got them to recognize this is the dumbest rule in the planet, and got me instead engaged with a gifted and talented program, and off I went. And over many years, I have repeatedly run into barriers because of my handwriting. There was another teacher, Dr. Lightfoot, an English teacher in high school, who saved me there. They actually, imagine this, Emily, they had a faculty meeting at my high school around what are we going to do about Bror's handwriting?
Oh, really?
Quote, none of us can read it, and therefore we're going to have to take action. And I didn't hear about this until long after I graduated from high school, this meeting. And it was Dr. Judy Lightfoot who got up at the meeting and said, this is ridiculous. This is a meaningless conversation. I can read his writing just fine. If any of you are having problems reading his writing, you bring it to me and I will read it out loud to you. Let's move on to a different topic, right? When I was in Oxford, trying to pass my exams and all this, my mathematics after my time as an undergraduate in the US, I got a call from the bursar of my college who said, Mr. Saxberg, you're going to have to stay an extra few weeks because we don't believe we can read your handwriting on these mathematics exams. And we're going to have you spend time with a scribe and a policeman to make sure you don't cheat as you read out what you actually wrote. And I thought to myself, that's par for the course. That's how it's going to work. They actually managed to figure it out, and I didn't have to do that. But so I've had so many experiences where people really were ready to hold me back because of my handwriting. One more, I've got a lot of these. One more, in second grade, the teacher, and her name was great, Mrs. Fink. Can you imagine a second grade teacher named Mrs. Fink? Awesome. And she had a little exercise she wanted us all to do during the year. She was like, hey, we're going to learn to write. So everybody's going to write a few sentences and I'll give you feedback the next day and all this. So we all wrote sentences. We all gave her the sentences. And she handed back her feedback, except to me. And then she called me up to her desk and she said, I was called Bill in those days. She said, Bill, I can't read this. And I thought to myself in second grade, here we go again. And she said, I'll make a deal with you. If you agree to make a verbal presentation to the class every week, instead of writing a few sentences every week, I will get what I want, which is, can you communicate? And I don't have to read your handwriting. Will you do that? And I thought to myself, I will take that deal every day. So I spent that whole second grade year taking my mom with us to the university library. My dad was a faculty guy. We combed the stacks. I dragged down books, brought them in, gave a little talk every week. And that was how it worked. So, sorry, I went on too long about this. But the reason I tell the story.
No, it's fascinating. What did it make you think about yourself?
Well, so this is the point. Nothing at the time. Because all these different teachers over many years intervened in a way that did not communicate to me that I was a loser, right? That I really didn't even know in first grade that Mrs. Hutton had to go to bat for me to get me to promote to second grade. I found out about that years later. And and Mrs. Fink, it was just a conversation. It wasn't like a big deal. And the same thing with, Dr. Lightfoot. I didn't even know they had a faculty meeting about my handwriting. And then she stood up and said, stop talking about this now, right? So years and years later, as I began to engage with how do we think about learning and advancement and personalization, all these things, looking back on my history, I realized I am literally the product of like a dozen years of almost perfectly adaptive education by incredibly gifted and talented educators who intervene, not just substantively, but also from an identity perspective. So that I knew my handwriting was awful. I mean, I started typing in 6th grade. My parents got me doing that.
Yeah, I was going to ask.
Oh yeah, so we did stuff, but basically, yeah, that was fine. And so the teachers were like, great, you're typing stuff. I mean, it's kind of weird for a 6th grader to type stuff, but okay, that's fine. And it wasn't until, like I say, decades later, looking back based on what I know about learning and motivation and all kinds of things, that I realized, wow, it was because of those interventions over all those years that I was actually able to succeed and prosper, even though I had what to many teachers was a real deficit. And it never came across to me that way. It was more like, no, we got it. We'll handle it. Yeah, it's an issue, but we got it. We'll handle it with you. And so to me, that's kind of an example that I now look back on to say, look, and it comes from things like Todd Rose's idea of, spiky students, this notion of everyone is a mix of things that they are good at, things they're not so good at, things that they're kind of average at. And the real key is, how do you take advantage of what people are good at without stumbling over the things that might be actually quite difficult for them? And looking back on my, my journey, academic journey, I realized that pretty much accidentally, I managed to have teachers who were really good at helping me get over those problems that I had. And they were serious problems. They still are problems. But without me either having been delayed from a content standpoint or from an identity standpoint, it was never communicated to me that you are bad at learning or that you are not a good writer because of the mechanics of my handwriting. And to me, part of what motivates me going forward is that shouldn't be accidental. That should be intentional, that every student should have the benefit of teachers with expertise and understanding who can help students achieve their potential while, maximizing what they're good at, working around the things they're not so good at, and making a success out of it. It's complicated though, because, one of the things about learning and teaching is, look, if a student is not good at something, shouldn't we spend a lot of time bringing them up to standard? And there's a real tension between that and spending the time to let students accelerate based on what they're actually really good at. And I'm not saying there's a simple answer at all.
Sure.
There is a tension that has to be understood and then worked through. And in my case—
And that is what we are chiefly exploring, yes.
Yep. And
please
in my
finish.
case, teachers made decisions that I think have ended up, I guess you could say, gosh, what could Bror have achieved if only they had fixed his handwriting in the earliest years? But I feel like I've actually done okay with primitive handwriting the way I have, so far so good.
So they sort of waived the standard for certain things for you in service of the broader standard.
Exactly. And I would even, the other part of this that I would say, and I know we might be spending too much time on this, is my own family, my parents had a really interesting approach to this, which again, I think was accidental, because there was no cognitive science in the 1960s. I mean, nor were they connected to any of it. But they basically applied the same kind of pressure to what my brother and I were good at to what we were not good at. And the pressure was, are you working at it? Are you really putting in your best efforts to it? And that was the thing that they detected, they talked about, they looked at. And they never got that upset that my handwriting was despicable, even after a lot of effort. They kept wanting to make sure I was putting in effort to it. But they put in that same effort into things like my mathematics or the composition, the writing things that I was doing that I could actually pull off with some facility. And even though you might have said they could have, let up on my mathematics and said, well, why don't you spend more time on that handwriting thing? No, they just kept pressing. Are you pushing hard enough in the science work?
In both.
Yeah. And if the sense was, nah, you're kind of lightening up on the math stuff, even though it was going very well, well, then that was their push to say, come on now, take another math course, bump it up a notch, let's go. And that, now, of course, we think about growth mindset, we think about Carol Dweck and, Angela Duckworth's work. Again, it was accidental that my parents took that attitude. Now, it was partly because my own mother had incredibly bad handwriting, and she herself managed to achieve a lot of great things in terms of her own education in architecture and art and, medical illustration and so forth. So she was already sympathetic to this issue. But regardless, their approach to this, I think, really helped me. And again, I only kind of understand the cognitive psychology, social psychology, even neuropsychology of the benefit I got from that in retrospect. And, wouldn't it be great if all families could actually help their kids in this way? Wouldn't it be great if teachers in schools could wrap themselves around their students in this same kind of way? And that's part of what I'm really engaged by in the work that we're doing at CZI and beyond.
Yeah. Well, let's bridge to that. Tell me, from your research, from your learning, from your work and experience, what do you feel like we know this works?
So there's a number of things. And some of it, what's fun is about, research is it often validates things that good teachers have known for millennia.
Yes.
It's not like, whoa, this blinding insight about jumping up and down on your left foot while closing your right eye and how it helps with understanding fractions. No, there's no research that says any of that actually works. It's not like that, right? But some of the key stuff that I think is so powerful and engaging are things like, the non-academic and the academic are completely tied together. You cannot separate these things. And so you have to think about a student's emotional state. You have to think about their own identity, as they walk into a subject, before you can get to the mustering of cognitive effort required to do complex cognitive tasks that we all want students to actually become good at. And, especially, now when we think about, issues with the pandemic and students coming back and so forth, and we'll come to this, I know, in a minute about what are some mistakes that people make. It's a mistake to think because we are so behind academically that we have to focus exclusively and only on the academic side, because that's just not how minds are built. If a student comes in thinking, I'm no good at math, you really have to address that right up front, because otherwise it's really hard for that student to start, persist, and put in mental effort into, things around learning math or math problem solving or whatever, because they'll keep coming back to this fundamental issue of, why should I bother? I am no good at this. And it's a very simple thing that comes out of some of Carol Dweck's work, this idea of, yeah, you're not good at it yet. So let's face the reality. No, it's not that you are good at it, you just didn't realize it. It's like, no, you're not there yet. But there is work to be done, and if you do it, we can get you there. And similarly then, storytelling about others who've been in your position and how they also dug in and got going and were able to make progress. And all of these things then start to help students recognize, I can do this. Another key, really important issue that comes out of relatively recent work over the last 10 or 15 years are these ideas about the impact of toxic stress on learning. And it's really profound and fundamental. It's at a neurochemical level. that cortisol, which is one of the hormones that are released when you are under continuous stress, both short-term stress, but also long-term stress, that when you're continuously flooding your learning systems with cortisol, it turns out it actually gets in the way of the neurochemistry of learning. It actually blocks a whole variety of reactions between, axons and neurons in terms of learning. And so, again, as students come back and have been in very stressful conditions, and now it's especially stressful, right? You really have to think about, how do we lower those stress levels as students come in? How do we help them have a sense of belonging in this place with these other students? How do we get them to empathize with each other? And even the other side, which relates again to some of Carol Dweck's work and others, Jason Okonofua, how do we help the teachers to recognize, what are students going through? Because often the teachers and the students are coming from very different cultures, and having teachers begin to open up to understand, what is that complex experience of a student coming back in, and that it is not the same as your experience or your children's experience as a teacher, is incredibly important to then be able to work with that student, make use of their context, make use of their assets, make use of their strengths, and recognize, we've got to make this a safe space for every one of those students who are coming back. Because otherwise, I mean, it's not a moral question, it's not a question of ethics, it's not a question of, culture. It's literally a question of chemistry. If the stress molecules are not actually addressed, as students are able to find their school to be a safe, comfortable environment for learning.
So interesting.
So there's a whole wide array of these things. There's also specific elements and important elements about, how you really have to spend more time on practice and feedback. That is, if you're spending 60, 70% of class time with a teacher broadcasting, you are missing what most students need. Really, teachers should be broadcasting 10%, 20% or less, and students should be practicing and getting feedback for 70% of the time, 80% of the time, in order to run their brains. It's when your brain runs that it actually starts to cement things. Hearing is important to get a sense of information, maybe the start of motivation. Why is this important? But what really matters for learning is practice and feedback. And that's as true for non-academic skills as it is for academic skills. I guess that's the final piece I'll leave you with, which is, we try pretty hard to have learning progressions about, let's say, mathematics or reading and writing. Even in science, we think about progressions for that. Our analysis and work on non-academic skills is often not nearly as systematic. And teachers are often not nearly as well prepared to recognize levels at which students are on non-academic skills and non-academic capacities, nor are they as well prepared to figure out, what are the activities I need to construct or create within the academic environment, ideally, maybe outside that allows students to begin to build their non-academic capacities, whether it's executive function or social and emotional interactions and empathy and communication skills, or those identity issues. We're not giving our teachers enough help with, how to resolve those issues. And they really are important to get into if you want your students as a whole to succeed.
Rings true to some of what we were talking to Pam Cantor about also. Very interesting. So let's flip to talking about what we try that we know actually doesn't work. And, this comes from a very urgent place of wanting to make sure that the treatment to exacerbated inequity doesn't lead to furthering that very inequity. And so what would keep you up at night about what you worry we're going to do that we actually have evidence does not work?
Yeah, I think I alluded to this earlier that, one of the things that I worry a lot about is that teachers and administrators, in a panic over their yearly state test score results and the professional consequences of those, will think that the right answer is to dive immediately and rapidly into a whole variety of drill and kill, grinding away at academic tasks, on the grounds, and it's well-meaning, it's very well-meaning, that we just lost more than 2 summer vacations worth of time. Right. And, we've got to get going here too. We can't just let this sit like this. And it's coming from a place of wishing the best for students, but I think it's missing the multidimensional perspective of human development, which says, the non-academic and the academic, they are so tied together, you cannot separate these things. So if you do not spend some time really settling the culture of your school, making students comfortable in their skins, in their classes, and I would argue, having teachers, even more than they used to, begin to develop some sensitivities to what are different experiences of students and cultures of students compared to their own. If you don't do that, you run the risk of basically, bulldozing, depending on the class, 20, 50% of your students, while trying hard to accelerate the 60% to 30% of students who you happen to know well and happen to have the same culture that you do, or have happened to have had a very reasonable experience through what's been happening over the last 7 months. So one of the things I worry about is that people don't spend enough time up front. There was an example in Houston, I think, after Hurricane Katrina, of a school that was closed for, I don't know, it was a month, 2 months, something like that. And everyone came back, and there was real nervousness about, my gosh, we're so far behind. And the school leadership just said, we're going to spend 2 weeks getting to know each other again. That's all we're going to do. That we're just going to talk to each other. What has happened to your family? Let us understand each other. And then we'll get back to work. They had the biggest test score gains that year of any year they've ever been involved. And that was after like a month, 2 months of literally being wiped out and in the middle of all this stress. But that investment in saying, no, let's get everybody together. Let's make it into an empathetic group of learners who look after each other. And then let's get going. It made an enormous difference. And so I think that's one of the risks. There are a number of other kind of risks that come, or mistakes. Again, people are well-meaning, but things like, and it's still out there, things like learning styles, this notion that, kids can be kind of bucketed into, kinesthetic or verbal or visual or whatever it is. I still am waiting for somebody to put on olfactory, smell learners. Come on now, that's another, come on, let's do this. And in fact, the research shows very clearly that no, brains do not bucket. Now, and it, as with much of this, it's subtle, because you need many different routes for complex topics. That sometimes for a kid, the visual approach doesn't work, but the auditory approach does, or the kinesthetic approach will work and the visual approach does not. So you need many different ways of doing things, especially things that are hard. But what is not the case is there is not a pattern. It's not like it works the same way for a kid all the way along. And this is a thing that a lot of teachers and parents, honestly, are still thinking is an important aspect of their own children, is trying to understand what kind of learner they are. It just has no evidence behind it, unfortunately. And then the other one, and I mentioned it before, is, this challenge of helping teachers increasingly get students to engage, to practice, to produce, and then get them feedback. That feedback can come from the teachers. It can also come from peers. You have to have scaffolding for the peers, because again, a peer may not really know how to give feedback. They may not know what they're looking for either, right? So you have to be careful not to let the peers take things sideways. But with the right scaffolding, peers can actually be pretty good feedback engines for each other. And of course, then the expert teachers can too. But that notion of really looking to see, are you giving students enough space and time to produce and struggle is a very important thing to actually look for. And it's so easy for teachers to fall into a mode of, I am teaching. I am giving myself to my students and not thinking it all the way through to, but that's not actually what's going to cement this. I need the students to produce on their own and then adjust over time.
Super helpful. Anyone else we should be learning from?
Well, I guess, education and learning and development, it is a complete multidisciplinary sport. It is not a thing where you can narrow your blinders down to one group of folks. So, like the toxic stress stuff comes from a bunch of, clinical psychologists working in, kids pediatrics, people like Jack Shunkoff and others. And they are not the kinds of folks who are typically showing up at education conferences, right?
True.
But they know an awful lot about how, what gets in the way of learning. And it's really important to listen to them. Similarly, even behavioral economists, Todd Rogers and a whole group of people related to him have been doing work over the last, 5 years, 10 years on nudges and, simple things to help parents and students end up even things like just attending more, just, showing up in school and doing small changes in the language of notices to families and parents can actually make big differences in how the parents actually act. And again, behavioral economists, that's not exactly who shows up at School of Education luncheon series, right? And then the whole range of psychologists, social psychologists, motivational psychologists, behavior psychologists, cognitive psychologists, all of these have insights that are relevant. And one more group, and it's kind of fascinating, anthropologists. So there's at Carnegie Mellon, Ellen Herkus has done a series of really interesting studies. This is in the higher ed side, looking at why is it that evidence-based practices end up not getting used in university education. And Carnegie Mellon University has some of the finest, cognitive psychologists, people involved with education technology, people involved with learning measurement tied up with educational psychology. I mean, these are learning engineers par excellence, right? They know more than most of us in America about how to do this. And yet they found that their CMU faculty were just not using any of it, right? Which is kind of amazing. It's like the shoemaker's children, right? It's like, how come we can't get this to work? And so their insight was to say, this is an anthropology problem. This is a problem of people and society and settings. And it's a complex thing. And we have to try to understand what is going on. And so Ellen and a couple of other people I think she worked with, they followed some attempts to implement cognitive psychology grounded interventions in higher ed and were able to see how they failed. And they failed in many different interesting ways that were not at all related to the intervention itself, but were related to how are faculty incented? How do faculty talk to each other? How much time do they have to actually do work on learning as opposed to their own research work, and a whole range of these things. And I know we ourselves at CZI, we're looking at bringing in similarly some psychologists to look at some of these challenges with this upcoming fall reopening. How is it that schools are tackling this? What are they doing new? How and why? And how do they maintain this? And so trying to understand from a systems perspective.
That's interesting.
A total perspective. Well, what goes on? What are those conversations? What are the influences? What is the formal and informal hierarchy that leads to success or challenges with these things? And again, we don't do enough to figure that out. And this is one of the key issues around translation
Mm-hmm.
from promising research ideas into practice that sticks and actually can
At
work
scale.
and is
Yeah.
doable by normal people,
Yeah.
is trying to understand what are the things that get in the way, and then problem solving around that,
Mm-hmm.
rather than standing back and saying, well, we gave them the white paper.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what their problem is. We told them how to do it. And so
Mm-hmm.
that kind of thinking and language almost always means, no, you did not engage deeply with what's actually going on at the front lines. So how do we actually do that as a piece of that? Another person I mentioned that's really interesting is Jason Okonafua, who's been doing work similar along the lines of what Carol Dweck and Angela Duckworth have been doing. But some of his work has been focused on that teacher side. What is it about teacher mindsets that can really make a difference to things like disciplinary actions with students in the schools, and kind of appreciation of the history and variety of students they have? And there's something very promising, I think, there about opening up the mindsets of teachers about their students and the differences between what students are bringing compared to what teachers are thinking they're bringing. And I think that's powerful work indeed.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Bror. I've learned a lot and appreciate your perspective, and looking forward to continuing to learn together.
Thank you for asking me.
Take care.